This is Michael Reed Trice at Religica. Today, our associate, Saeed Osman, is speaking with Carolyn King, who is the former elected chief of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Elder King is engaged with governments, colleges and universities and businesses and community organizations to lead cross-cultural training sessions and presentations that help people develop a better understanding of the Aboriginal First Nations people in Canada. We invite you to take a listen.
This is a Religica production. Religica.
In Canada here, we're First Nations, or the Indigenous people of this lands, and that we're one of the 600 plus First Nations in Canada. We're the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We live here in southern Ontario, mainly, and all around the Great Lakes. So our First Nation, in the early days of building Canada, we were part of what they call treaty lands, making treaties between the British government and our ancestors. And so one of the key ones is that we're here at this event in Toronto. Well, we signed a treaty, 1805, it's called the Toronto Purchase, and that we signed an agreement to give up this land for the settlement of the people coming in. And so we keep coming back. We don't live here now. We live about 60 miles away on an Indian reserve here in Canada. We have an interest in this land. This is our people lived here. Our villages are here. Our bones are in the ground. Our medicine sites are here. So, and those special places are still of interest to us. So we come back here often to relate to them.
You talked about the special interest sites being still within the greater Toronto area,
Yes.
and as well as about the treaty. I'd like to ask some more about what the process was for the First Nation community to sign a treaty with the British government. Like, what was the history behind it? How exactly it took place? Was there a lot of controversy, or Yeah.
I would say the British government of the day had a process.
Mm-hmm.
And in our First Nation, our ancestors signed 23 treaties with the governments of the day before Canada was Canada. So that's 1763 when they did the proclamation for Canada to become a country. So it was the whole idea of settling the land. Then they talked to the First Nations people, and they said, give them meetings with them and saying that they wanted to take the land. They needed land for the new settlers. So there's actually a concept called presents, where they offered them presents to give up the land. And so they did pay money, in most cases not enough, and they promised them care, in which case blankets, wood, things. If they left the land where they were living on and went and moved someplace else, they would be looked after. And that's what the treaty process is in this country.
Yeah.
Where they would be looked after.
And so these 23 treaties that happened
In around the southern Ontario.
Okay. And this was all prior to the 1763 proclamation?
Ours were.
Okay.
Yeah. And most of them were that, because it was called Upper Canada at the time under the British rule.
Okay.
And that's so we signed with the British government of the day.
Okay.
But they also signed the rest of Canada too later.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are 660 First Nation communities
In Canada, yes.
Okay.
And they would have a council and of a chief and councillors, and that they would be recognized as a First Nation and a legal entity.
And so each one of the 606, I'm interested in learning more about how this process works. For our listeners, I think for many people who have simply not encountered and learned too much about the community, the First Nations community, and I'm interested in learning more both on how things have progressed through time, as well as kind of the direction First Nation communities are moving into the future. And I think a lot of our audience are Americans. I'd be interested in potentially contrasting from what you understand between Indigenous communities in the United States versus Canada.
Well, we're all Indigenous people.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And that, so people of the land. And that being that we're in two different countries, that the United States has different legislation that allows the tribe. In the United States, we're called tribes. Okay, it allows the tribes to take more control of their future, in which case they have, back in the 60s, things started to change, and that they have the Self-Determination Act, and they have a related act called the Reorganization Act, and that allows them to have their own government and run it the way they see fit to run their particular. In Canada, we don't have that. We have initiatives that are being promoted by the federal government to do what they call self-government, in which case we would kind of do the same thing. You start to take control of your life or your nation's life. And so in our political bodies, they're working on those kinds of things. What would and we call it a self-government initiative. What would it look like if we take over the education and it's not the mainstream education? What would our version look like? Who's going to fund it and all those kinds of things? There was just a move here in Ontario where the government give the, I think it's Treaty 9, authority to run their own education system. So things are happening and changing. And like in most of our First Nations here in Ontario, we get funding from Indian Affairs or the federal government and also from the provincial government to deliver programs in the community. And therefore we have to follow those rules mostly. And so now it's starting to change that we will be able to run programs that's more suitable for our people.
And what do these programs look like, the ones that are potentially more suitable? Is it primarily learning more about culture and language?
Yes, that language can be part of it. Cultural can be part of it. Why not our own art as opposed to some other settlement communities' art? Also in the even in the way that our schools are built. You know, if we choose to be in a circle, and we can teach in a circle and not sit in straight lines behind a box type thing. That's what I was raised with.
Yeah.
You know, all just lines of desk and sitting at a little square desk type thing. And we marched into school, and you know, we had to do all those kinds of things is the way the federal system did. And that was those early days. I was not in what they call residential schools. I did day school. We left our home and went to the school in the community, just like other places.
Okay.
And so it wasn't separated from the family and moved into a like a boarding school, which was just close. So my mother was in that. She was in the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, which is about 15 miles away. And a lot of people were in our communities were in those schools.
So can you elaborate a little bit more about those type of schools? So you talked about residential schools. And
residential schools they're referred to now, and that so when to go back, idea in the settlement of the land from the British government that they would take up the land and they would look after us. That included education, health, and well-being. And based on our way of life, that kind of didn't fit that British concept, in which case they wanted us to go to school, learn how to farm, look after ourselves, and learn how to pray and believe like them. That's what I was put in. I went through the Anglican system here in Canada, so went to church on Sunday, and the traditional people, they don't go to church on Sunday. It's more of a seasonal, living with the land and the seasons here. So a lot of our people rejected going to church, and even rejected going to school in some cases because they didn't want their children taken away. But those who did, the residential schools were set up in order to educate and prepare the children for the new future. And that's reading and writing English, and learning how to farm and look after yourself. That's kind of what happened with our people.
I did want to circle back a little bit on your experience becoming the first female chief of the Anishinaabe. How was the experience? Like, what happened prior for you to become the chief, and how has your experience been since? Like, now you're a former chief, and I mean, I know, in some cases of former mayors or former presidents, and they sometimes have still quite a lot of influence, and I'm curious if that's sort of very similar.
Yeah.
Okay.
So before I worked for the First Nation.
Yeah.
I was the community economic development person. And so I did a lot of community development. That's what I say my strength is I like working in the grassroots work. So when we have a need to make things happen, build things, develop programs. So, I thrive on that kind of work, making things happen, making a change for the better.
Yeah.
And that, and that also means stopping some things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, so as the community development worker, I was a very busy person, and still am, doing everything. When I say community development, that's doing everything. And that's like building buildings, getting people jobs, promoting programs that's going to serve the community, representing the community out there to say that this is what we want, this is what we need, planning for the community. Our little community is a planning community, so I've got a lot of background in planning processes. So using the mainstream planning process, and then ideally the way that we would plan, linking more to keeping the resources alive, that we're not going to tear up and rip up everything. Mother Earth, Mother Nature does that in its own right.
Yeah.
So I decided to run because I did a lot of that stuff. I did all of that building of work, and things didn't seem to be going the way they should. And that I was fortunate after we did our comprehensive community planning process, which is no different than a mainstream official plan. But we set up a plan for what we needed and where we wanted to be in the future, a 20-year plan. And so I worked so I could keep that plan going. And then I left. I chose to leave.
Tying this back to the spiritual side of things, a lot of what tends to motivate outside of, say, fame and fortune is what we want to do for God or for our Creator. And I'm curious if that's among the motivations of simply, beyond giving back to part of giving back into our community is being thankful for how the Creator has given us blessings in this world.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. That we just did some things that we're building a new arbor in our community, which is like a pavilion.
Yeah.
Type thing, where and it's not like it's something. You might go look at it and say that's just a gazebo.
Yeah.
It's a pavilion. So we're working away on things,
Mm-hmm.
and that I had the paper, but I think it's left on my table back there, and that we were trying to get a banner done that was put together for our for the event,
Mm-hmm.
and our student wrote a very nice, what I almost say encapsulates what we're trying to do as a people.
Yeah. Just as you're pulling it up, I was curious if you just have any final thoughts that, for our listener.
One of the things that I advocate, promote, is that, our people had a way of life and a belief system, and that it should be respected as well. And that it may not be the same as the mainstream, but it has sustained our people for thousands and thousands of years. And that I think that should be recognized. And that many of our people are, for lack of a better word, lost and looking for something, and looking for some place to belong.
Yeah.
And in the belief system that everybody can belong. We have a Creator. There's a power above us that helps us in our world. And that and part of that whole world is the natural world,
Yeah.
but gives us our life. That's a nice way to put it.
You have been listening to Religica. Visit us at www.religica.org.